what do you think you've learned most, or maybe the most important thing you've learned from having all these conversations with other griefsters for your podcast?
I think the biggest thing, and the reason I wanted to write the book and the sort of ethos that, as I hope, is in the book is, and I always, I'm smiling as I say it because it sounds really bleak, but you don't get over it. And what I mean by that, because sometimes if you're not in the club, that can sound like, oh my God, what? What do you mean you don't get over it? It can sound like, oh, I wake up every day and I'm weeping. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is that when you experience capital G grief in that way, it stays with you. You know, sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're furious, sometimes you're depressed, sometimes you're numb. Like, that's the thing with grief. When it lands, when you get it, this sort of this mess, as I call it, the grief mess, it's every single emotion coming at you 1,000 miles an hour at the same time, which is why this idea of like 5 stages or anything being quite neat about grief is a fallacy. It's not true. Sometimes it is very boring to think, oh, here we go again, another grief wave, like, oh, and especially when you're farther down the journey like I am, and as you see it walking towards you, like, oh, here we go. But what I've learned is to welcome it. And I know that sounds strange, but I used to fight it and be like, I'm going to run as fast as possible so you do not catch me up, grief. Like, I'm not going to feel you, whatever you think you're going to do. Whereas now I think, oh, hello, grief. Yeah, I am sad about that, aren't I? I can't deny the feeling of sadness anymore. That's what grief is. Your life grows around the grief. It's not that you are expected to park that grief. It's done, I'll never think about it again. But actually what you have to do is carry it alongside with you. And that's what I've tried to explain in the book, that there's ways to make the process of carrying easier and lighter, but I can't take it away from you.
Yeah. And you mentioned the 5 stages of grief, which are not the 5 stages of grief, which are not a thing. Why are they not a thing?
So, well, they are. I mean, it's someone's theory. So this theory was written by a brilliant, brilliant woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. The thing to caveat all of that with is she actually wrote this not for people who are grieving. She wrote this after working in hospitals and working with patients who were dying of a terminal illness, usually cancer. At the time in America in 1969, they weren't telling people they were dying. So they would go into hospital with their malignancy and they would give them medicine to cure them. And they didn't know this was absolutely palliative care and they were going to die. And so, you know, you'd have people saying to their family, I think I'm going to get better. And the family know they're dying. But it was all this, oh, it's worse. Don't tell them, don't tell them. And her theory said, if you tell someone who's dying of cancer that they're dying of cancer, they'll go through 5 distinct emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, when you say it like that, you go, oh, that makes sense. I can understand that you go through this sort of process of, oh, I am dying, that's what's happening. And then you reach this point of, oh, okay, I can accept my death and I can die with a certain level of peace, knowing that at least I know I'm dying. So she wrote it for people who were dying. And I cannot tell you, I've no idea when it became sort of like evolved and twisted and eaten up into this idea that it was for people who were grieving. Because it makes no sense for grieving. It only works as a theory if you're offering a full stop, and the full stop is death. But grieving people don't suddenly die. We have to carry on living. So how can we ever reach this place of acceptance and everything's fine? Because I'm living still with this pain. And what's really weird about this theory is that people still believe it.